It had the robot tuners on it.
Yep.
He was so proud of it. He was showing it off. He's like, man, check this out. It tunes itself. And
Yeah.
we get 3 songs into the show, and it literally malfunctioned where he hits this big open A chord, and it thinks that he's trying to tune it, and it goes... Somehow it tuned itself to like Dadgad in the middle.
Oh.
He's holding an A chord and it just goes in the middle. He was like, oh, and literally returned it to Guitar Center the next day.
Yeah.
Hey everybody, I'm Rick Beato. On today's Everything Music, we're going to be talking about what happened to Gibson Guitars. They've just apparently are filing for bankruptcy. They're in a whole heap of trouble, and I've got 2 experts with me that are both Gibson owners and phenomenal guitar players, Rhett Shull and Dave Honorado. Now Dave, I've talked about on my channel many times, Dave knows more about guitars, amps, any kind of musical gear than anyone that I know. So I called him up and I said, Dave, when you're coming over to grab my guitar to fix it, can you also... Thanks, Dave.
Yeah, man.
Appreciate that. Can you...
60 or 70. How much was it?
Can you also sit in on our discussion? Okay, so let's talk about this. Rhett, why don't you start out?
Basically what's happening is at the end of July, they have a whole bunch of debt that's coming up, and if they don't refinance or take care of that debt, it's going to default, and they are headed towards bankruptcy. So it's something to the tune of over $500 million, I believe it is, but it's not good.
Okay, so why, Dave, is Gibson in this position? Let's tell us a little history on Gibson.
Well, my take on it would be, there's plenty of information. You can go through the whole history of Gibson easily, but I'll spare you that. But I think where it kind of started going wrong for Gibson was probably realistically about 10 years ago. Their wood supplies started getting cheaper. They couldn't get as good wood as they used to get. They've always had, in different periods of wood, problems. Like mid-'80s, they got some really good stuff. And then like early 90s, they had some stuff that was good. By the end of the 90s, it was starting to get a little suspect. They started using weird fingerboards instead of Brazilian. They started using Indian rosewood. And now we're up to baking maple and painting maple and composite cardboard, rich light things, stuff like that, So Les Pauls have been around since 1952, and the woods that they started making those guitars originally with, they were pulling from woods that were already at that point probably 100, 150 years old. So, those trees got depleted by probably the 70s, early 80s. So by the early 80s, when Henry bought the company, Norland was sandwiching everything they could, 5-ply tops and 13-ply necks and all this stuff. They were really just banging them out, getting them out, and that's where everybody started wanting to buy 50s guitars, 60s guitars, because they started realizing all these players were like, well, man, the new ones are junk. I mean, you pick them up and they're like, they weigh a ton, they don't sound right, they don't play right,
and they weighed a ton because the wood was
because the wood was not the same wood, and for some reason the premise was in the 70s, like heavier the better.
Right.
So that monkey kind of got stuck to like, if it's heavy, it actually sustains better, which is the complete opposite.
Right.
But that was sold as a selling point, and so everybody started putting like brass hardware in their guitar, and 13-pound Les Pauls and all this stuff. And then by the early 80s, everybody was like, well, why, we did all this and it still doesn't sound right. It still doesn't sound like 50s guitars. So all those early guitars went back way up because the guys who knew the difference were like, man, you can tell right off the bat, Now your normal average players, whatever, they couldn't afford some of that stuff, so they were buying new stuff and it was fine, and so and the cycle of vintage guitars is usually 20 years, so it's hey, I had this when I was a kid, so I don't care if it's good or not, I want one, and then it becomes good because you identify with it.
Sure.
Yeah. So my first guitar was like a 66 Fender Mustang, which by the time I was 20, I thought it was a complete piece of crap. And then, now I'm like, no, they have their purpose, they have their tone, and so it's a thing. But and a lot of people grew up on Mustangs later than me, who, those were amazing guitars. So it's all point of reference. But back to the wood, definitely by the early 90s, in my opinion, Gibson's wood supply was really starting to get, low as far as their good quality stuff. They kept some high-end stuff for their 59, 58 Les Pauls, some of the upper end jazz box guitars, 175, Super 400s, that kind of stuff, and of course the acoustics, J200s, that kind of stuff. They would keep the better stuff for those, but your realistic guitars that really keep the company going started to really get cheap, and you could feel it, and you started. Especially in the mahogany, the mahogany was really heavy, so they started chambering them to lighten them up, and so they used that as a selling point, as like, oh, it's chambered and it's much better. Really, what they were doing was just trying to make the mahogany lighter because people were complaining that it was so heavy, and they had no other way by doing it except drilling holes in the top and making channels bigger.
And then they cover it with a maple.
They put a maple top on it typically,
Right.
So, and granted, your average Les Paul Studio is basically an $800 to $1,200 guitar,
Right.
And until they came out with the Epiphone stuff that was in real competition with them, that was basically the entry level Gibson.
But why would they even come out with the Epiphone model? I don't understand what the purpose of that was. That made no sense to me.
Well, I think basically they were still getting beat by Japanese companies and Korean companies at that $500, $600 price point.
Right.
And people were like, well, I can go buy an Ibanez for $600. That's better than the Les Paul Studio for $1,000. So they needed something to compete in that, in that category as far as a, $300 to $500 guitar that still had a Gibson name on it, and was licensed by Gibson.
Right.
And the other fact is, if you know anything about Les Paul copies, you go outside the U.S., there's a Les Paul there's thousands of them.
Right.
And so there's like Tokai, Greco, all these companies that make great Les Paul copies. And they were all, saying $500-$600.
Sure.
So people were like, well, I can buy one of those. So Gibson had to be like, okay, well, let's just join the race.
Well, I know that I had a band come in, I don't know, 5-6 years ago that had a Chinese website.
Yeah.
That was buying guitars, Les Pauls, that were $250 and having them shipped over here. They shipped them in big styrofoam boxes.
Oh, yeah. Definitely.
They came over. They were made at the same factory where they're making the Epiphones.
Yep, in Korea. Yeah.
And
China.
And I mean, they had some cheap hardware on them, but for the most part, they looked exactly like Les Pauls. They had serial numbers in it and everything on it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Rhett, what else has Gibson been doing that's been killing them?
So I think where a lot of their financial troubles are coming from today is this idea that their leadership has had to sort of try and turn Gibson from an instrument manufacturer into a household audio brand. Their CEO, I read a quote earlier where he was quoted as saying that they want to be the next Nike. And so what they've done in the past probably 10 years or so is started acquiring companies like Philips and Onkyo and the DAW, Cakewalk, and Sonar, and all this stuff,
Which they
just recently killed.
Right.
They killed off to the chagrin of a lot of users. So they've spent hundreds of millions of dollars acquiring these companies, either for, I don't know, I guess rights to their products or intellectual property or whatever it is, and they're not seeing the return on those investments at all. And they're doing things like, I've seen Gibson is building studio monitors now that look like, Les Paul tops. That it's a pair of studio monitors that has a carved maple top with sunburst on it, which is like, I don't know if you're into that kind of thing. That's great, but to me,
it's right. It's a niche market. That's maybe 20 guys in the whole country that would buy those.
Yeah.
And if those guys are going to buy it, they would get somebody to custom make them anyways. Because would you get Gibson to custom tune monitors?
No.
Right.
Okay, all right. So one of the problems with Gibson over the past 10, 15 years is that they're just overpriced for people. The only people that can buy Gibson are doctors and lawyers. Mm-hmm. And that's been the problem, essentially.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not only that, but then they came out with these ridiculous things. The robot tuners, the
Firebird X.
Yes, yeah.
Just,
I mean, horrible
nobody
products.
was asking for.
Right.
Nobody was wanting. There was no portion of the market of guitar players that was like, what, I need a guitar that tunes itself because I'm too tired and lazy to do it on my own.
Well, I think honestly that was, that's the head of the company and the PR department really not knowing their niche and really not knowing their core customers. I mean,
even though he's been Henry Jaskowitz has been there for
Yeah, he's been there since like '82.
right.
You know,
How could he not know what the company does? I mean, that's
yeah, to me,
ridiculous.
because he did turn that company around from Norland. I mean, they were bankrupt when he bought them, basically, and he saved that company. And I'll give it to him. The first 10 years when he was there, they weren't the greatest models, but they were a vast improvement of what was being made by Norland. And you could tell the people that were making them gave a crap, you know, and the quality, you know, I work on a ton of guitars now, and I see a lot of 80s model Gibsons come through, and I work on them all the time. And for the most part, most of them are put together right.
So what would those be? Those you're talking about standards,
Yeah,
customs,
standards, customs,
studios,
335s,
juniors,
right? Any of the standard model stuff, you know, Firebirds, Flying Bees, that kind of stuff. And for the most part, if they were treated right, they're still great guitars, and so that's just proof that actually those guitars were built right. You know?
Okay, now there is the elephant in the room is the fact that not a lot of people play guitar anymore because of EDM music and the availability of DAWs where people can just pull out a MIDI keyboard and record anything. The, as I say, the barrier to entry to playing something and putting it out on your SoundCloud or Facebook page is you need a little MIDI keyboard and a USB cable, essentially.
Yeah.
You put on some loops, you sing a vocal, you rap on it, whatever.
You got a band.
All of a sudden you're a band and you can get on the radio. So in order to play guitar, you got to go through a few years where you can actually play well enough to
right.
play a song.
Right.
But what's interesting about that is even though the guitar market as a whole has seen a decline in the last few years, Gibson as an instrument manufacturer has still been profitable. I mean, they did over $1 billion in revenue last year. They're still one of the most profitable names in the guitar manufacturing industry, and that portion, all the other financial stuff aside, that portion of the business of Gibson USA is still profitable and is still a viable company. So I think what we'll see is if they end up going bankrupt, the brand is not going to go away. Gibson is not just going to
Somebody will buy. Somebody
will buy it up.
The name will get bought.
Yeah,
because it's too big not to, and it's too much of a legend in this industry not to.
Okay, how much of this profit, this $1 billion, is from the custom shop? Is that factor in here?
I'm sure it does. I think, and that is something we should talk about too. That Gibson USA, Gibson Memphis, Gibson Custom Shop, and the Bozeman, Montana plant are actually almost separate companies.
Yeah.
I mean, they're run differently by different people, and so that's been most of my personal experience. We're all Gibson owners here,
and that's why we have the Gibsons behind us here.
Yeah. So my 335 back there, that's my baby. If the house is on fire and I could grab one thing, and my wife was okay, I would grab the 335 there, and that's a Memphis guitar. And so most of my experience with Gibson, modern Gibson, has been with playing custom shop stuff, which was, to my experience, unbelievably good. And the Gibson Memphis stuff, which is also incredibly well made and awesome. But as we were talking about earlier, it's just insanely expensive, especially the custom shop stuff. For a 59 reissue Les Paul, I mean, you're talking anywhere from $7,000 to $10,000 from the custom shop. Now, I think the point there is you're kind of getting into the law of diminishing returns, right? Where it's like, okay, if I really want the 59 sound, the custom shop has gone to extreme lengths to recreate what a real 59 was. So it's like I could spend $10,000 on one that I feel comfortable with actually taking out and playing and touring, or I could spend $300,000-$500,000 on a real burst that I'm going to lock away in a vault and sit on for 10 years.
10 years.
Yeah. Well, 2 maybe. Make my money out of it. So, I mean, I think they are still a viable instrument manufacturer. It's just the leadership is not making great decisions on everything else. Even in the modern, Gibson USA, they keep releasing models like the Boogie Van Les Pauls that they just
ridiculous.
Yeah, and there again, to me, that goes back to you don't know your market. To me, for the last easily 5 years, to me, it's like desperation mode. They're just grabbing at straws, trying to be like, okay, well, what's the hip thing of the month we can do with something? To me, that company has been around so long that it's like just make 10 really great models, and then have a separate custom shop if you want to take that model and have
Really,
something
really,
done. Okay,
yeah.
then have a 10 grand guitar and it's your own thing and it's but have the set price point be $1,000 to $2,000 across the board for a Firebird, Les Paul, SG, all this stuff, and have it at that. Just really make great guitars in that price range. Don't get crazy with all this custom stuff. Make what guys want and use. I mean, because you go to any bar, if there is any live music anymore, 9 times out of 10, the Gibsons you're going to see are the stuff that's like Studio Les Pauls, basic model SGs, juniors, specials, everything that's $800 to $1,000 that a real musician can afford.
Yeah.
That's the market they need to focus on, because ultimately that's what's saving their butt. I mean, and Epiphone, I'll tell you right now, to me, Epiphone is what's really saved that company.
Yeah.
Because as far as what I work on daily in my repair shop, I mean, I'll get 12 Epiphones a month, and I might get a half a dozen Gibsons, but so Epiphones by far are outselling everything else, and that's where they're making their money.
I think Gretsch is a good example to look to for what Gibson should be doing.
Exactly.
Gretsch Fender, owns Gretsch if you don't know, and I think they are doing exactly what you were just talking about, which is like they have their models. If you want a Chet Atkins or a double cut Black Falcon or whatever it is, they have their models that they are known for, but then they also have the Electromatic series,
which are excellent guitars.
Yeah.
Excellent for the $800 to $1,000 price.
I would have
range.
no problem taking one of those guitars to a gig, and playing the hell out of it.
They're
because
great.
they're great, and so as with the Epiphones I played. Once they're set up and tweaked out, man, they're totally a really giggable guitar.
So this whole idea of price range is really important. I personally.
You have one. You're special.
Right, exactly.
One of your main guitars.
One of my main guitars.
That's one of the guitars you play the most.
This guitar here I bought for about $600, probably 10 years ago, something like that. I went to Guitar Center. On the wall, they had a bunch of these. Okay, I picked up the best playing one and bought it. I don't even know if it was 600. I want to say it was 550.
I think originally those were like in the 5 to 7.
This is a great playing guitar. Do they even make this anymore?
Not this particular model, no. I mean, they make a special, and they do. Yes, you can get this guitar, but this particular one with the thin finish and the thinner body, they discontinued.
This is an amazing guitar. I don't know why they're not making this guitar.
I don't know why either. To me, that's a no-brainer.
That's a no-brainer. This is the right price point here.
Yeah.
And that one is, if you'll look, is not relicked. That's real.
Yeah, that's real.
That's real Rick relicking here.
Yeah, right.
The neck, everything. So
don't get me started on relicking.
so, anyways, so that's that to me is the price range that they need to be looking at if they're gonna solve their problems. There's not enough doctors and lawyers out there to buy these things. Really, there aren't.
There's not, and I can tell you from experience the whole thing of like, the custom shop is an investment. They're one of the worst investments ever. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I've seen guys sell guitars for a little more money, but this whole thing, if I keep a custom shop for 5 years, I'm going to make.
It's ridiculous.
You lose money. You
lose money instantly.
It's like buying a new car and driving it off the lot. You're instantly 60%. You just lost.
Right.
So at that point, if you really knew your market, you would be like, okay, well, that's a specialty thing, and we'll do that. Like you said, like Gretsch has they make a small amount of high-end, White Falcons and stuff. They're all handmade, and that's cool, and they need that. That's their flagship, But your bread and butter stuff, the Electromatic kind of things, the Les Paul Studio stuff, that kind of stuff, that's what really sells. That's what really the market is.
Okay, so here's the problem I have. When I look at a Gibson Les Paul Custom, and it doesn't have an ebony fingerboard on it, it's not a Gibson Les Paul Custom. I mean...
Right. I agree.
What do they do about that, Dave? They can't get that wood anymore.
No, and they've gotten to the point where, unfortunately, the EPA laws have gotten so tight and so strict, and the wood supplies are iffy. And of course, the Gibson had a problem with their whole wood supply a couple of years ago with that whole debacle. So basically, the Les Paul Custom has to have an ebony fingerboard on it. Okay, that's just sort of in the psyche of all guitar players,
right.
I think. So, now they're trying to bake maple and paint maple and do all this other stuff, and they're still trying to justify getting real money for those guitars. Which I consider real money being anything over $2,000-$3,000.
Yeah,
that's real money, and so. That in itself,
I think that there's a price point that you can't go beyond, which is probably about $2,500-$2,700.
Yeah, for a normal musician.
For a gigging musician,
Yeah.
that is
Yeah.
that is pretty much the top.
I
I'm not
agree.
going to pay that much. I'm not going to pay over that for an amplifier. I'm not going to pay
Yeah.
that much for a guitar.
Yeah.
Honestly, I don't have any guitars that cost that much money. I mean,
No,
I
actually,
went and
yeah.
I was at Guitar Center. I talked about it on one of my live streams. I was at Guitar Center
Yeah.
last week, and they had an ES 175. I don't know what year it was, but
Mm-hmm.
it was a Matheny reissue. It looked like
Oh, yeah.
59.
59
59
yes,
blonde.
yeah. Okay, yeah.
And played terribly. Now, I don't know what the deal is with it. I don't know if it was a custom shop or what the deal is. What
Well,
is the
okay.
deal?
I will say partly. I won't blame Gibson for that kind of stuff
Okay.
because most guitar centers take a guitar, throw it on the wall,
Yeah.
and it sits there and it goes through extremes. And so I've had people bring me guitars like, hey, I just bought this from Guitar Center, and I'm like, the neck is like a ski slope, and I'm like, well, they just threw it on a wall and sat under hot lights, and under tension. So you can't blame Gibson for that. You know,
Okay.
that's but as far as structural things, like some of the historics that I've seen have come through without bone nuts on them. They're using composite nuts, which is to me is ridiculous. It's like you're paying this kind of money. I think they can spend $2 for a bone nut.
They wanted $3,600 for this guitar used.
Yeah, that guitar new. If it's the '59 Matheny looking one, typically those guitars new are like $5,000 to $6,000.
That's unbelievable. I mean, that's just ridiculous.
And you start talking to me, in my opinion, if you start talking that kind of money,
Yeah.
buy the real thing. I mean, you can buy a real '50s one for $7,500.
Right.
If
you're going to spend $5,000, if I'm going to spend $5,000, I'll save up and spend.
buy the real thing,
And
Exactly.
you're gonna
Yeah.
get your money out of
Yes.
that.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
Because again, they're not making any more real 59
right?
175.
Exactly.
So I think you're right. It's if you're past that threshold of $4,000-$5,000, you're really shooting yourself in the foot by buying a brand new guitar. Unless it's something that like you were talking about, you have like some of the really high end, well made replica stuff.
Yeah,
it's like the real wood.
Yeah,
the exact
There's a
way.
lot of small boutique builders that have good supplies of real wood still left, old growth wood. And as far as I'm concerned, if I was going to spend real money, that's what I'm going to spend money on because you can't get that anymore.
Yeah.
And that does make the big
They
difference.
have the original wood.
Right,
That
and
is
that makes
that
a
age.
huge
Yeah.
difference. And so it's one of those things where Gibson doesn't have that anymore. If they do have a supply of it, it's so small that they probably only keep it for artist models that go to Richie Sambora or whoever's in the Joe Perry or whoever's in the custom shop.
Sure.
They have probably some select boards of that stuff, but overall, they're still baking their woods now. They're this new fad of we dry kiln woods. That's fine, and I've played a lot of guitars that weren't done that way, and they're fine. But it also tells me that the wood is still so green and so heavy in water content, and they're running out of woods. They're trying to figure out how they can replicate still the old woods, and that's how they're doing it.
Okay, so speaking of old woods, we're at my old Gibson here. This is my 1957 Country Western. So Dave, why does this sound so good?
Well,
Why does this guitar that I've had for since 1999? What is the deal with having a guitar that's 60 years old?
Well, especially in an acoustic, the biggest thing is this wood, the spruce, and of course this guitar's a mahogany back and sides,
Really light
solid.
mahogany, yeah.
These have dried out, and the more you play an acoustic, and the more dry it is, the bigger it sounds, the more louder it is. So that's why the older Martins, Gibsons, Epiphones, all that kind of stuff is so coveted. And not saying that they're all great because they weren't, but a majority of them sound incredibly better than most of the new guitars, and it's strictly because that wood is dried out. The molecules in the wood, from playing it over years and years, it's cured that wood a certain way, and it's dried out a certain way, and it just rings, and you can just hear it. Even with dead strings on a guitar like that, you can usually tell. Man, it still sounds great.
Yeah, I mean it's amazing for recording. It's amazingly good.
And typically, there are like the new Bozeman model Gibsons. I will give it to those guys. If I was going to pick of all of the companies that Gibson has going for them, quality wise, the Bozeman is still the best made stuff.
Okay.
And here again, why? Because that company is very tiny.
Yeah.
There's not that many guys working at
So
that.
quality control.
Quality control is excellent. I've worked on a lot of the new Gibson Bozeman stuff, and I've yet to see one that had really any kind of inherent problems and that didn't play and sound right. Did it sound like an old one? Not necessarily, but they have their own merits too. And those guitars will age just like these will age.
Sure.
there is one slight difference that this is nitro lacquer, where the newer guitars, they can't use complete nitro lacquer now. They're using kind of a composite lacquer, a water-based
What does that
lacquer.
do to the sound?
It affects it.
Okay.
Straight nitrocellulose lacquer has a thing where it just breathes, and it just has this inherent thing to it. It's organic, and and it sounds ridiculous, like the magical mystery thing. But there is something about it. Whereas the new finishes, of course, polyurethane kills a lot of stuff because you're basically just pouring plastic over a guitar.
Yeah.
So that's why the lower end stuff sounds so dead, because it has plastic all over it, and that wood is not the same wood. So that's the biggest difference on the acoustics.
What kind of rosewood would this be?
That's Brazilian.
That's Brazilian. Okay.
And even what's really funny is even on this guitar, new was actually not considered that high of a model.
Sure.
This was kind of low end, mid range.
Yeah.
But all of the original 50s, 60s Gibsons all had Brazilian rosewood. So even their cheapest model, LG1, that was like $99,
Right.
still had a Brazilian rosewood because they could get it. And I always wondered if that was a conscious decision on them, like they really knew what they were doing with the wood, or whether it was just a happy accident.
They probably just had so much of it.
I think that's probably what it was.
Yeah.
The modern Gibsons, even the higher end, the custom shop, the Memphis stuff. I know you said this about the Bozeman, but do you think that like a modern, like this 335 here?
Yeah.
This is a 2011 Memphis. Is this going to age the same way this is a 61?
Yeah,
reissue.
that's a dot neck reissue. Yeah.
Yeah. So is this going to age the same way? If I give this thing 50 years.
It's hard to say. I personally don't think so for a few reasons. The finish being that it is a nitro finish, but it's not completely nitro. It's a little different than what the 50s and 60s and 70s guitars had. The other thing with that guitar, it's that wood in that guitar. I'm going to guesstimate. Of course, I'll probably get crap for this, but there'll be some guy bitching about it. But anyways, I would venture to say probably the wood in that guitar is probably 30 to 40 years old, maybe what they're drawn from, or less, but I would say maybe probably in that range. That guitar, will it sound like a 5961 original one? No, for a lot of reasons. But sonically, it'll be close.
Yeah.
It won't be exact, but it'll be close. But anytime, it all depends on how much you play it, and the kind of care you give it too.
Yeah.
So. But I do know that finish definitely changes the tone of the guitar, because I've had the dead-on 59 historic reissue Pauls, that they're great guitars. I'm not going to sit here and bash them because they do a great job on them. Now, were they worth $10,000? I don't think so.
Right.
But they, as far as aesthetically and the way they're put together, they're built right, and they're doing the best they can to make every kind of year a little better maybe than the last. But when it still comes down to it, you still have greenwood and you still have that finish, and so it's not going to age the same.
Yeah.
And now that's not saying that they're not going to be great guitars and that they're not great guitars, but to say the difference between those two, the old ones are still going to be the old ones because of the wood and the finish.
I think it's cool. I think it's important to talk about too. Like, if somebody has a guitar that we've maybe not been speaking so highly of, that if it's something that you have that you find inspiring to play, and that you love, and that makes you want to pick it up and play it and get better on it, then that's, as far as I'm concerned.
I mean, that's ultimately.
Yeah,
that's ultimately.
Here's a perfect example. The guy always comes to mind when I think of this. You got Jimmy Page.
Yeah.
Played 58, 59 burst, and then he played a Dan Electro.
Right.
And he still sounded like Jimmy Page. He still kicked ass on both of them. He had a $50 guitar that he basically put a new bridge on, and did amazing stuff on, and then he had two real bursts. So ultimately it comes down to the guy playing it too. But as far as where Gibson's going wrong, I think that's a big part of it. You've got too expensive wood that's gone, and a guy who's running the company that just really is out of touch with who he's selling guitars to. And they shouldn't be this conglomerate big thing, because we all know anytime a company goes from this to this, it's never good. So, and if the company is making money, which they are making money, unfortunately, I think they have to. Obviously, the shareholders. That's the biggest thing. They're trying to, they're doing that whole. Like,
well, they've had all these failures and all these other businesses that they've tried to.
And I don't blame
with.
a company for trying to expand and trying to maybe go into another market. But to me, it's like I've gotten that feeling from that company. It's just like, well, the guys at the top, they don't really care about the.
Well, Dave, when I went into Guitar Center 3 years ago, and I saw those ridiculous tuners on
the robot tuners, I've de-roboted about 10 of those guitars.
I mean, I thought to myself, what is this?
Man, I was on a gig one time with a guy. He had just bought, a friend of mine had just bought a brand new. It was basically the modern version of the special.
Yeah.
It had the robot tuners on it.
Yep.
He was so proud of it. He was showing it off. He's like, man, check this out. It tunes itself. And
Yeah.
we get 3 songs into the show, and it literally malfunctioned where he hits this big open A chord, and it thinks that he's trying to tune it, and it goes, somehow it tuned itself to like Dadgad in the middle.
Oh.
He's holding an A chord, and it just goes in the middle. He was like, oh, and literally returned it to Guitar Center the next day. He got his money back.
No, I've actually had pro players. Actually, Chris Green, who we both all know. He brought me a robot Les Paul a couple weeks ago, and he said, is there anything we can do with this? I was like, yeah, get rid of all this junk, and you actually have an okay Les Paul. Right. And so we did. I took the gears off, gutted all the electronics out of it, put the standard good stuff back in it, started locking Grovers. It turned out to be a great guitar, So, and I don't blame them from trying to, because Gibsons do have inherent problems. Thus, another gripe I'd like to acknowledge. In this day and age, the scale length on a Gibson,
sure,
and everybody who owns a Gibson knows.
Everybody knows that they don't tune because the scale length.
G, B are constantly out of tune,
right? And
you have to temper tune them and tune them sharp to get them to play somewhat in tune,
right?
To me, like if I was the head of Gibson, the first thing I would do, okay, well, we do have a problem with this tuning issue. Yeah. Okay, how do we solve this?
Which they probably should have done about 25 years ago.
Right, and even it's funny because even later on, I've talked to some guys who worked for Gibson and Heritage and some other companies, and there was all kinds of stuff in house where guys were like, "Can we just make the scale length a little bit longer,
right?
Or even just half-ass it where it's not okay. It's not 25 and a half like a Fender, but just a little bit longer, just to get it a little bit closer."
Sure.
And it always fell on deaf ears because I think of 2 reasons. They would have to retool everything, and it would cost a lot of money to retool.
Yeah.
And their whole thing was, it's that traditional, like, well, we've always done it this way.
Yeah.
Which all of these companies, like Gibson, Fender, Rickenbacker, all of these American companies, Martin, all of them have this, well, it's traditional, and that's how we've always done it. That's great. But doesn't mean that it always worked, okay? Yeah. And especially, like I said, I work on these guitars all day long, and it's one of those things where if they just would make the scale like just a slight bit longer, it would solve quite a bit. And the other gripe with a lot of people, well, the neck always snaps here. Why did they make this like this?
This one's had a break.
Yeah, and I've got one here that I've this one's got a break too. It's got the nice little smiley face. It happens, but.
Mine doesn't.
Yeah.
And it better not.
Yeah. Just wait.
I don't know, man. I don't think it's a real Gibson until it's broken.
Yeah, right. Well, that's the other thing. I always tell people, it's funny because I get a lot of guys that have repair guitars and they bring it in and I'm like, oh, the neck's been broken. And I said sometimes it actually helps because actually, if you put splines in it or and do it right, it actually can be stronger than a piece like that.
I mean, I've looked for guitars like that.
Yeah, I have guys
to buy, but I never can find any.
Right. So. First of all, like to me, okay, I will give it to Gibson. They tried to make a long scale Les Paul, but they did it in a really stupid way. They didn't just like make it look normal. They put like 345 slide inlays in it, and they changed the binding, and they tried to do all this stuff, and the heel was weird. And it was like, well, no, or have an option of you know what, I want a long scale one. Just have a long scale one if you want the traditional.
Call it the Gibson, the modern Les Paul.
Yeah.
Longer scale.
Long scale. And
coil tap pickups.
There we go, Henry.
Right. It's not. It really isn't rocket science because most people, if you got the traditional, so no, I want the original. Okay, fine, buy that. We offer that. Right. If you want this, it's a slight upcharge maybe. If you really are, it's all about dollars and cents. Well, okay, then upcharge $50 for a long scale, whatever. but fix the problems that are inherent in the guitars that are actually good and that people want to buy, instead of coming with robot tuners and
Yes.
Firebird X's, and like in the 70s and 80s it was the Sonex guitars that were made out of MDF,
Right.
and it's the Corvus guitars that were basically leftover bodies that they cut in and it looks like a can opener,
Right.
Gibson's always been a little weird on their, I don't know what it is. Man.
Which, I mean, that's kind of endearing, right?
Yes.
Like, okay, cool.
Well, at least they're trying. Like I said, at least they're
trying.
trying. But again, though, these guitars, a 335, a Les Paul, a Firebird, they're all great guitars, but they all have inherent problems. Why not work on those problems and fix that and just make a really good model of that for a modern guitar? Now, and if you got the guys that are traditional, I want the old stuff. Then
make that.
That's fine.
Make that.
Yeah. But as far as I'm concerned, man, if you're making a Les Paul Studio and you're selling for $1,000 and a gigging musician is playing it, why not? You don't need robot tuners. Make the scale length a little longer and put some really good gears on it and build it right, and it's going to stay in tune.
And market it that way.
Right.
I mean, that's the thing, man. Like with so much of what you're talking about, come out with a Les Paul Studio, modern player, whatever, long scale LS, and market it to real players, guys that are on bar gigs.
Perfect example, and you'll know this because you've done a lot of bands like this. Guys who come in, the guys that tune way down, they'll tune down to C. They'll turn it, and you try to take a Les Paul Studio or any Les Paul with a 24-inch scale and tune it down to those things, even with the heaviest strings on it, you still have massive tuning problems.
Oh yeah.
And how many?
I deal with that all the time.
Right. So,
honestly, they stopped playing Gibsons.
Right.
That's the thing. Is that
And
all
so
the bands I worked with that tune way down.
Instantly, there's a market right there.
Yeah. They stopped playing Gibsons because of that.
There's a company out of touch with guys who are using their
Well,
stuff.
I mean, they honestly missed that boat back in the 90s and early 2000s.
And I got to tell you, there's no... I'll say it right off the bat. The reason PRS started dominating in a lot of metal fields was because he had a longer scale.
Yeah.
And it stayed in tune better, and he had better gears. I'll give it to him, man. He knew the market.
That's when I started seeing those guitars show up all the time.
As soon as Creed started playing those guitars, and that whole wave of bands came in, and they were all detuned, and then it got even lower.
Yeah.
Man, all you saw was PRS guitars, and that was a big part of it. And I worked on those guitars for guys, and they would say, "Well, I want to get my Les Paul to do." I'm like, "You're not going to. You need to use your PRS." And they go, "You're right, man. After we did that, the PRS stays in tune great." The scale length, that's a big part of it. So, and that's a huge market. I mean, and this is how stupid it is. Gibson actually they almost hit the mark. They came out with a Gothic Les Paul, a Gothic Explorer, but they didn't put the scale length any different. All they did was repackage the same thing that they had, and they missed the mark. And it was like, if you would have just put a little more time into it, instead of just trying to make donuts and get 50,000 out the door, actually improve the guitar, they would have gained a market.
Sure.
And they would still be selling the crap out of those guitars.
Right. And again, going back to the boutique thing, I think that's why the boutique world has exploded in the last 10 years, is because people sense that that's what these large manufacturers, Gibson and Fender, are doing, is they're just trying to crank out volume.
Well, all they need to do is go into your local guitar shop and they see the things that Gibson's putting out, and they look ridiculous. And people don't want to buy guitars that look ridiculous.
And especially the last, I would say, 2 years, we were looking at this before, these multicolored top striped Les Pauls that are $6,000. They came up with this Chinese Year of the Dog one this month. It's like, it's almost like they're trying to put the company out of business.
Right.
That's almost been my take on it.
This is the best way that I think I could describe it was last year around NAMM. It was a satirical ad that got put around like the gear page and everything of the new Gibson Les Paul, and it was ridiculous. It was bright pink and all this crazy.
I remember it.
And
yes.
If this shows you where Gibson is at, I thought it was serious.
Right.
And most time I've got a pretty good nose for sniffing out that kind of stuff. And I sent it to a friend of mine. I was like, dude, look at this.
Yeah.
This is what they're doing now.
Right.
Because it's supposed to be ridiculous, but it's not that far off from what they've actually been doing with like the Firebird X and the robot tuners and all this crap.
Yeah.
So this thing with Gibson really started. People started talking about this in the past few months. They did not go to NAMM.
No, they went to CES.
Yeah.
And that was a really big thing. People in the music industry were talking about it constantly. What's going on with Gibson? What's going on with Gibson? I heard the rumors of them going bankrupt months ago.
Yeah.
And if they'd like to consult with us, they can contact me here at this channel.
Yeah.
And we'd be happy to come in and talk with Henry or whoever you'd like at the company.
What's our 15%? we'll figure that out.
Yeah,
later,
let's get Henry's lawyers involved.
Yeah.
All right, so that's all for now. I'm going to bring these guys back in again, and we're going to talk about what's going on with Fender next time.
Yeah.
Thank you all for watching. I'm Rick Beato, Dave Honorato, Rhett Shull.